Dr. Teryn Clarke, welcome back. So excited to have these monthly conversations with you. And so one topic that you brought up last month on our conversation was this, I don't know if it's the right word is concept, but seed oils. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Like, I don't know anything about that. What does that mean and how does it impact our brain? So I know that's a topic that is in your book that you wanted to have a conversation with today and let our audience know what it is and the impact. So why don't you start with explaining just what seed oils are and where they come from, and we'll get into how it impacts our brain.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. I think seed oils are really emerging as a topic in health in general. And so they can be kind of confusing, which is why I like to have a conversation about them. Of course, I do cover them in the book, and I think the book is written in a conversational way that's approachable for people. But seed oils are really impacting our health in a big way. And I don't think there's been enough attention to them in general. So when we talk about seed oils, what we're talking about are all the common cooking oils. So canola oil, soybean oil, safflower, sunflower, vegetable oil, corn oil, and most vegetable oil at the grocery store is actually going to be soybean oil. But
Okay.
they're oils that are pressed from the seeds of vegetables instead of from the flesh of the vegetable or the fruit. So when we're talking about seed oils, we're not talking about things like avocado oil or olive oil. Those both have seeds, but those oils are made from the flesh of the fruit, so they're not seed oils.
And when you
And
say flesh of the fruit, does that mean like the skin?
yeah, olive oil is pressed from olives, like the part of the olive that you eat. It's not
Okay.
pressed out of the seed of the olive oil of the
Okay.
olive. And same with the avocado oil. It's pressed from the oils that are in the flesh of that fruit. Um, so the seed oils are different because they're pressed out of the seed, and it takes really extreme temperature, and it also takes then cleansing them or bleaching agents to make them clear. And so those toxins can leave residues in the oil itself. So part of it has to do with the toxins that can enter the oil as a function of how they're made. But the real problem with them is their composition. And so we have to step back and talk about omega-3 fatty acids, which I think probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with. We generally associate omega-3 fish oils with good health. It's part of the reason that we want to eat a lot of fish is to get those omega-3 fatty acids in our system. And those are polyunsaturated fats, PUFAs for short. So you may come across Instagram reels that are talking about omega-3 PUFAs and omega-6 PUFAs in this realm, this conversation about seed oils. So omega-3 fatty acids are generally anti-inflammatory, which is great. We're all suffering from too much inflammation from our diet, from not exercising, from the toxins in our environment. And so omega-3s are associated with decreased inflammation. We know that inflammation is part of heart disease. It's a big part of Alzheimer's disease. It may be the biggest piece of what leads to Alzheimer's disease, in fact.
And that'll
So
probably lead to another conversation we have. But with that inflammation, it's the plaque buildup in the brain that has that impact on Alzheimer's. Is that right? Do I have that
yeah,
right?
that's one of the things. When we look at people who passed away from Alzheimer's disease, we see quite a few different processes going on. So the toxins building up, those abnormally folded proteins, amyloid and tau are part of the picture. Inflammation is always a big part of the picture. And Stanford doctors who were able to completely shut down inflammation had the biggest response in terms of stopping Alzheimer's disease and even reversing brain disease. So inflammation is a really big part of the processes that lead to Alzheimer's disease. I think we could probably spend a whole episode just on inflammation.
Okay.
We'll have to put that on our list. So the omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. And then there's another classification of omega fatty acids that are omega-6 fatty acids. Those guys are pro-inflammatory. So the way we've lived in our environment historically is that humans have taken in these polyunsaturated fatty acids from foods in a more natural balance of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 of a ratio of about 2 to 1. So even though we've always taken in more omega-6 fatty acids, our body could handle that ratio without inflammation getting out of control. What happened with these seed oils, they're super high in omega-6 fatty acids, and our intake, since they were originally derived and they were originally machine lubricants that now are in our food, what's happened as these have become the predominant oil, we're actually consuming the majority of our calories from these seed oils, which is remarkable. And that shifted the ratio that we're taking in from 2 to 1 omega-6 to 3 to 15 to 1 omega-6 to 3. And so that is a ratio that our bodies can't overcome in terms of dampening down inflammation. So that's a big part of it. They're super pro-inflammatory. And when your listeners, I mean, you look at any processed foods.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, where do these seed oils show up? Because I think, like, well, I don't necessarily cook that. Well, I don't really cook that often.
Right.
But like, when I'm using vegetable oil, it's like, okay, well, that's one aspect. But
Right.
with that kind of ratio you just described, those have got
Yeah.
to be showing up somewhere else in the food that
Right.
we eat.
So when you realize that Americans are eating 70% of our foods are ultra processed foods, the seed oils are always a big source of calories in those ultra processed foods. They're in every ultra processed foods. And if your listeners start reading labels and looking for these guys, they're always towards the top of the label. They're everywhere. So getting them out of your diet, or at least decreasing the amount that's coming into your diet, there's the big targets and there's little targets. We're not going to get them completely out of our diet. It's just impossible. When you start looking around, it's overwhelming. And so I want to reduce that overwhelm by maybe talking about a couple simple ways you could target really reducing your load of these oils. Little changes that make a big difference. And then not sweating some of the little changes that aren't going to make a very big difference, really prioritizing where we could get rid of some of these guys. And then we also need to talk a little bit about how else they're dangerous, because they set off this oxidation storm that damages our cells. So I don't know which way we want to go first, maybe talking about some ways to cut them down and then coming back to a little more science. I don't want everybody to tune out because we're over sciencing here.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. So do you know, so why are these oils so prominent in processed food? Is it because of the nature of the processed food being able to be stored, or like, I'm curious about like why these show up in processed food?
Because they're cheap.
Okay.
That's the number one reason. They're super cheap. And so they're part of industrial food manufacturing. The big cheap ingredients that are in everything are seed oils and refined sugars, high fructose corn syrup. There's an interesting book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, and that really goes into the corn subsidy and how that has created super cheap calories, which are mostly coming through corn. And that's a big source of seed oils. It's a big source of high fructose corn syrup, which was first created in 1979 and has become a major ingredient in a lot of our food. So it's really these industrial processed foods. They're mostly refined sugars and seed oils, and then some sort of refined grain that's stripped of most of its nutrients, but they're really cheap ingredients. And that's why
Yeah.
they're so prevalent. That's why food has, recently inflation has changed food prices, but in general, processed food has gotten so cheap. And that's why people are gravitating towards it, not only for the convenience, but it's also sometimes much cheaper than whole food options.
Yeah, I remember like looking at, because it's from our one of our very first conversations like a couple years ago. I remember going and looking at a loaf of bread and it having like high or having that high corn syrup ingredient in it. I'm like, what in the heck does bread like? Why is this even in bread?
Right. And that's the thing. It's not like people are going out and seeking seed oils and wanting to eat this stuff. It's just that it's crept into our diet. And we didn't know the health ramifications of it when that started. But now we're looking at a tidal wave of chronic disease across all age groups. And it mirrors what we're seeing with our intake of seed oils. So, the other big problem with these seed oils is they're unstable. So that means they're really susceptible to oxidation. And that's another concept, we talk about anti-inflammatory things and inflammatory things. We talk about oxidants and antioxidants. And so oxidation is part of what happens in Alzheimer's disease in the brain that causes damage, but it happens throughout our bodies. One of the most important places that it happens is in our arteries. And once our arteries get damaged by oxidation, then they start responding by building plaque. And that leads to hardening of the arteries or atherosclerosis. And that leads to kidney disease, heart disease, brain disease everywhere. So that's a universal process. And how these seed oils play into that is most restaurants are going to use seed oils in their fryers because they're cheap, and that's just what they use. And so those fryers get heated every day and then cooled every night. And the oil can get reused for a week or two. And so as that's happening, when they get the seed oils come to high heat, they generate a compound in their oxidation process that's called 4-hydroxynonenal. We just call it HNE for short. And so they generate that HNE and that gets incorporated to the foods you eat. And then when we ingest that HNE compound, which easily comes through our digestive tract and into our circulatory system, that oxidizes every tissue it comes in contact with. So whether that's in our blood system or whatever tissue ends up taking in that HNE, it sets off a firestorm. So it oxidizes tissues and it converts other chemicals in our body to also become oxidants. So it's basically a charged molecule that recruits other molecules to be charged and damage tissues. So it's really dangerous because it amplifies its oxidative damaging capacity. And the challenge with fried foods is that we're super concentrating this HNE because we're heating the oils, getting it oxidized and letting it cool down, but they don't lose their charge. We just get more and more HNE in that oil as we reheat it day after day after day. It gets incorporated in foods. And then you have French fries or fried chicken, and now you have this firestorm of oxidation. So that's one area where, I love fried foods just like everybody.
I'm just
So
thinking in the back of my mind,
yummy.
I'm like, oh, I love Chick-fil-A.
Right. So I love fried chicken. I don't love French fries as much as I used to. I love sweet potato fries. And my problem is that I'm not a Brit, but I like them with mayonnaise, which actually the first ingredient is canola oil usually. So, there I would just say pick and choose. If you like French fries, have French fries once in a while, but the mindless kind of just having them whenever they're aside with whatever meal you're ordering, try to cut that down. Maybe you're out having a fancy meal and it's steak frites, and okay, that's an amazing combination and it's worth it. But when you're at places where the fries aren't great and you're mindlessly just consuming them, switch it out for a fruit or salad side or something like that. At least try to cut it in half. That makes a big difference. And then from there, you can try to cut it further. But just being mindful and picking and choosing. When it's really worth it, enjoy it. When it's kind of mindless and you're just on autopilot, skip it. And that's how I would go about that. But that compound is super dangerous. So eating out, try to limit your fried foods. You're just not going to find restaurants, high end or low end, that use anything in their fryer besides seed oils.
Seed oil.
Even McDonald's back in the 70s, they used lard, fat, tallow. And so and you don't get the H&E from that. So it's changed even in our fried foods. I mean, it's hard to say our fried foods are becoming less healthy, but that's the reality. So we've got to decrease the amount of exposure, because we're not going to be able to find places that don't use seed oils in their fryers.
I'm curious, like in hearing you explain all this, my curiosity is naturally going to how how does the research come about and identifying all these things? Like I always like to go like another layer or two below, without getting like too wonky, but I'm like where how does one you're a licensed neurologist, like
Mhm.
how how does this information get to you? Like where does this research, you know, begin that starts identifying these things are in the food, these things are kind of bad for you or whatnot. Like that's kind of where I'm curious. Like where's this information come from? Where's the data come from?
That's a great question. So the data has been there for a long time, and it started with animal studies. Um, but I think how it's getting to me, because I'm just a private practice neurologist in Southern California. I'm not a food researcher. The way I think that it's coming out to physicians and then uh, kind of slowly diffusing out to the general public is really through an area of medicine called functional medicine. And that's a group of doctors who are interested in root cause medicine, not just trying to treat the symptoms of disease, but really getting into what's causing it. Not just treating high blood pressure with high blood pressure medicines, but looking a couple layers lower. What's causing somebody to have high blood pressure? Can we change their lifestyle? Can we address their nutrition? What's causing this? And so there's a big underlying functional medicine component to brain disease and Alzheimer's, especially as we realize that we're not making great progress with our treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So we need to step back a couple decades and really work on what's starting those brain damaging processes in the midlife. Um, and so, what I find is interesting is I'm on the staff at my local hospital, and I'm sure you've seen it, and I'm sure your patients have seen it, but there's a couple cardiologists I can think of off the top of my head at my local hospital that, I mean, they look like a heart attack on a plate. So, some of the traditional advice for cardiac health, the things they're prescribing and recommending, um, I started gravitating towards physicians who look outwardly healthy, and they almost universally are more focused on nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle as the foundation of medicine, rather than just heading straight to having people on 10 different medications. And so that's where a lot of it's coming from. I think there's really kind of a big groundswell of physicians who are taking a step back, critically looking at our education and finding the gaps there, which are largely lifestyle gaps, nutrition gaps. We had a little bit of nutrition where I trained at University of Southern California. I think we had more than most, and so that helped me be a little more open to thinking about food as medicine. But it's kind of a groundswell, and once you start peeking into that, behind the curtain of functional medicine, on Instagram, your feed gets just blows up with
Right.
really healthy physicians who are focused on lifestyle and really impacting their patients' lives in profound ways. So that's where it comes from. And then you start digging into the literature, and it's everywhere. I mean, the amount of research on H&E and health and seed oils, it's overwhelming. So that's what I was really trying to do with the book is you can find super deep dives into this stuff, but it's not that actionable. Reading the animal research isn't that actionable.
Yeah, no one's
But
gonna cruise through that.
yeah, so I'm trying to translate it, bring it to a level that everybody can understand. And then you start seeing it everywhere and you realize how much you're consuming. And then we can do simple things. I avoiding most fried foods. We all know that fried foods aren't healthy. Like we've known that for a
Yeah.
while. But this is just a different exact mechanism of why they're unhealthy for your body. And then, I think you can make a couple big targets. Fried foods, eating out are one, cut that down. Don't go
So now
crazy.
you're gonna
Doesn't
you
be,
because we were gonna come back to this, but
yeah.
and lay out like action items that you can
Okay.
actually like walk away from this conversation thinking, okay, I can start looking at this. Because I think what when you start explaining this, I think awareness always comes top of mind. Like like most things, whether it's financial related, relationships, health, it starts with awareness. And so, can you turn on that awareness switch? And then once you are aware, then what are the action items you can take?
Exactly. That's a great way to think about it. You're exactly right. Awareness is first, and then once you're aware, I mean, you want to make the changes because you realize how dangerous it is. So, the couple steps that will really cut out a lot of these dangerous compounds are the fried foods, and then the second big basket is home cooking, and that's two things. So, you cooking oils. I would highly recommend ditching all those seed oils. I would not have them in your house. There are easy substitutes that we can switch out. And you can do that gradually. When
What would be some of those substitutes, Teryn?
Yes, so the substitutes you can use for seed oils would be really getting back traditional things would be butter and cooking in fat. We actually cook in butter in a bacon fat a lot. My husband clarifies the bacon fat through a coffee filter, and we use that. It doesn't contain those omega-6s
And that's
that
the
are
thing
so.
is like when you say like bacon fat or butter, like I start thinking, well, wait a minute, that's doesn't sound healthy either. Like give me the seed oils. But what you're saying is that no, actually the butter, the bacon fat, it's actually better for you than the seed oil.
Yeah, I mean, when you look back at health and how humans used to live before seed oils were here, I mean, we didn't have the problems with obesity, the problems with chronic disease that we have now. So we lived with nature in which nature's provided, and that included a lot of beef fats or a lot of animal fats in our diet, and we didn't have the chronic diseases we have now. So part of it is really questioning this new narrative that these fats are healthy, that seed oils are healthy. The data doesn't support that. We've looked at, we can get back into the cholesterol hypothesis and how flawed the science is there. And when we looked at overall country level data of the countries that have more saturated fats in their diet and then had more atherosclerosis, when we really go back and look at those studies, there were a lot of countries that were excluded. And when you look at all country data, there isn't a correlation. So part of that is questioning what we're being told about cholesterol and fat. So we can set that aside for listeners who
Okay.
aren't kind of on that end of the spectrum, but most of functional medicine is actually returning to the more traditional fats. Um, but the oils we'd be using are the animal fats, and then avocado oil, coconut oil, and olive oil. And then there's an interesting one that are fermented sugar oils that don't have a high burden of omega-6 fatty acids. Those are a little harder to find. You generally have to order those directly from the manufacturer. So I would just stick with avocado oil, coconut oil, um, olive oil, and then the animal fats. So salad dressings are going to be a big source. It's really hard to find salad dressings on the shelf that don't contain seed oils. There's a couple brand exceptions. Primal is one that is mostly olive oil and avocado oil based. And so those are worth picking up. And what we do at our house is I just make a weekly dressing. I mean, it takes me 5 minutes. I have the couple recipes that I usually use on the inside of the pantry, and I just whip that up in a jelly jar, and we're good to go. And those are fresh and tasty. I've got a couple of my favorites actually in the book. So that's a way to avoid a lot of seed oils because most of the dressing is oil. And then cooking with those other oils. And you want to choose those by smoke point because that's a little below that is when they start to oxidize, and we're trying to avoid oxidants. They don't produce the H&E. like the other ones, but they still produce oxidants that you want to avoid. So you generally don't want to saute in olive oil because the smoke point is pretty low. You're usually be cooking at a higher temperature than that. So for sauteing, that's where I recommend generally that people move to avocado oil. It has a higher smoke point, or some of these fermented sugar oils. They don't have any sugar left. The bugs that ferment it get rid of all the sugar and
Okay.
just leave the oil behind. One of those that I use is called Zero Acre, and you can find that one online. And the beauty of Zero Acre compared to something like avocado oil or coconut oil, which you can use for high temperature, is that does have a bit of flavor that can enter your food. And some people don't like those flavors. It's one of the benefits of the deodorized seed oils is that they tend not to add a lot of oil flavor to the food. They're pretty neutral. So if those other flavors, coconut oil and avocado oil, bother you, then the Zero Acre seed oil, the Zero Acre fermented sugar oil is a great option because it's a neutral taste and it has the highest smoke point of any of those oils that I mentioned. So we use that a lot for high temperature cooking.
So far you mentioned obviously first one is try to reduce eating um fried foods. Second is substituting things that you're cooking at home um, trying to replace those seed oils with ones that you just mentioned. I think you were said there's a third like kind of action item that people can take.
The third item is trying to reduce processed foods. So the grab and goes, they're really convenient. They're generally really affordable. But when you avoid processed foods, you're avoiding a lot of sugar and seed oil. So it's kind of double benefit. So when you can pack up snacks from home and always have those with you, so you're not as tempted when you get hungry and you're out and about, that's a great step to try to prevent consuming those in a pinch when you need some energy to go about your day.
So if I go back to kind of like summarize our conversation, like one of the main reason why you're advocating trying to reduce because there's no eliminating, I think is what you've said, these seed oils from our diet is this idea of inflammation, which we'll get into in another conversation. But is that the heart of it, Teryn? Did I get that right? Where trying to reduce the amount of seed oil that you're taking in will help reduce the inflammation, which has all these other impacts on not only brain health but just our health overall.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a good point to wrap up this conversation. And again, viewers, any questions that you have for Dr. Clarke, feel free to send those in. I look at all the emails that come in, so just direct any questions that you may have and topics you want us to cover. And like we talked about, we'll add inflammation to that list going forward. But Dr. Clarke, thanks again for being on the show and helping educate us on our brain health.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.